The attic had always been off limits. Growing up in my grandmother's Victorian home, that was the one rule she never bent. "There's nothing up there but dust and memories," she'd say, her voice trailing off as her eyes drifted toward the ceiling. "Some memories are best left undisturbed." The way her expression would change, a flash of something between fear and sadness, had always fascinated me as a child. What secrets could possibly be hidden in a dusty old attic? But Grandma Eleanor was gone now. The funeral had been 3 days ago, a somber affair where distant relatives I barely recognized had shared stories about a woman I thought I knew. Now the responsibility of clearing out her house before the sale fell to me. My parents had moved to Arizona years ago, claiming the New England winters had become too harsh for their aging bones, and my brother was deployed overseas with the Navy. I was the only one left to sort through 6 decades of accumulated possessions, to decide what to keep, what to donate, and what to discard, as if anyone could so easily categorize the remnants of a life. The house itself was a grand old Victorian, built in 1892 according to the historical plaque by the front door. 3 stories of ornate woodwork, stained glass windows, and creaking floorboards that had sheltered 4 generations of our family. Every corner held memories: holiday gatherings around the dining room table, summer evenings on the wraparound porch, winter storms watched through bay windows while wrapped in quilts my grandmother had made. The thought of strangers living here brought a lump to my throat, but I couldn't afford to keep it, and it was too much house for one person anyway. I stood at the base of the narrow staircase, the pull cord for the attic door dangling above me like a serpent, swaying slightly in the draft that always seemed to find its way through the old house no matter the season. My fingers trembled slightly as I reached for it. Ridiculous. I was 32 years old, a successful museum curator with a master's degree in art history from Harvard. I spent my days handling priceless artifacts, giving lectures to crowded auditoriums, writing articles for prestigious journals. Yet here I was, hesitating because of some childhood prohibition, feeling the same anxious flutter in my stomach that I had at 7 years old, when I'd tried to sneak up these very stairs only to be caught by Grandma Eleanor. The stairs creaked under my weight as I ascended. The air grew thicker with each step, heavy with dust and the peculiar staleness that comes from years of disuse. When I reached the top, I fumbled for the light switch. A single bare bulb cast harsh shadows across the space, illuminating dancing dust motes that swirled in the disturbed air. The attic was larger than I'd imagined, extending the full length and width of the house. Dormer windows on either end were covered with yellowed sheets, filtering the afternoon sunlight into a sepia glow reminiscent of old photographs. Trunks and boxes were stacked in precarious towers, some with labels in faded handwriting I recognized as my grandfather's precise script. Old furniture draped in yellowed sheets resembled silent ghosts keeping watch over forgotten treasures. The floorboards groaned as I moved deeper into the room, my footsteps leaving clear imprints in the dust that coated everything. The air had a peculiar scent, not just the expected mustiness, but hints of cedar, old paper, and something else I couldn't identify. Lavender, perhaps. Had Grandma Eleanor placed sachets up here to ward off moths? The thought made me smile. Even in a space she forbade anyone to enter, she would have been meticulous about preservation. The temperature was stifling despite the late September chill outside. I shrugged off my cardigan and rolled up my sleeves, surveying the overwhelming task before me. Where to begin? The real estate agent had given me 2 weeks to clear everything out, but looking at the accumulation of nearly a century of family history, I wondered if 2 months would be sufficient. I started with the nearest trunk, its brass latches dull with age. The hinges protested as I lifted the heavy lid, releasing a fresh wave of dust that made me sneeze violently. Inside were photo albums, their leather bindings cracked and peeling. I set them aside for later examination, making a mental note to handle them with archival gloves. The next container held Christmas decorations, fragile glass ornaments wrapped in newspaper from 1973. I recognized some of them from childhood holidays: the hand-painted Santa my mother had made in high school, the silver star that always topped the tree, the collection of delicate birds with real feather tails that Grandma Eleanor would arrange on the branches with surgical precision. Hours passed as I sorted through the artifacts of my grandmother's life: baby clothes that might have been my father's or uncle's, carefully wrapped in tissue paper. A collection of hat boxes containing everything from elegant Sunday church hats to a flapper-style cloche that must have belonged to my great-grandmother. School projects from my father's childhood, report cards, graduation programs, Letters from my grandfather during his military service, tied with blue ribbon and smelling faintly of tobacco. Photo albums documenting vacations, birthdays, anniversaries, the visual record of a family's evolution through decades. I was so absorbed in my work that I jumped when my phone buzzed in my pocket. A text from Jessica, the real estate agent. Any progress on clearing the house? Buyers eager to close. Remember, everything must be out by the 27th. I sighed and texted back a non-committal, working on it, before turning my attention back to the task at hand. Jessica was nice enough, but her persistent reminders about the deadline only added to my stress. This wasn't just a house to be emptied. It was the physical repository of my family's history, and sorting through it required both efficiency and reverence. The afternoon light was beginning to fade, casting longer shadows through the covered windows. I should probably head downstairs soon, make myself something to eat, and continue tomorrow. But something kept me there, a nagging feeling that I was missing something important, that there was something specific I was meant to find. Near the back of the attic, partially concealed behind a rolled-up Persian carpet that I vaguely remembered from the living room years ago, I discovered a small wooden chest. Unlike the other containers, which were primarily functional storage pieces, this was clearly an heirloom, hand-carved oak with brass fittings and an intricate floral pattern inlaid with mother-of-pearl. And unlike the other containers, this one was locked. I tried the lid, confirming that it was indeed secured. The keyhole was tiny, likely requiring a skeleton key rather than a modern one. I searched the nearby boxes until I found a small lacquered box containing jewelry, costume pieces mostly, though a few might have been genuine, and beneath the tangled necklaces, a ring of skeleton keys of various sizes. The third one I tried fit perfectly into the chest's lock, turning with a satisfying click. The chest contained letters bundled with faded ribbon in various colors: blue, pink, lavender, each bundle seemingly organized by sender or time period. The handwriting on the envelopes varied, some in elegant cursive, others in more practical script, all of them addressed to either Edmund or Eleanor at various addresses over the years. Beneath these carefully preserved correspondences, wrapped in what appeared to be a velvet cloth of deep burgundy, was a silver picture frame. I carefully removed it and brushed away the dust with my sleeve, being careful not to scratch the glass. My breath caught in my throat as I examined the photograph within. It was a portrait of my grandparents, Edmund and Eleanor Miller. The photograph was professionally taken, the kind families commissioned for special occasions, anniversaries perhaps, or simply to mark a period in their lives they wished to remember in perpetuity. Based on their clothing, my grandfather in a double-breasted suit with wide lapels, a pocket square perfectly folded, his tie neatly knotted at his throat, my grandmother in a tea-length dress with padded shoulders, a cinched waist, and a modest neckline adorned with a simple pearl necklace. I guessed it was from the late 1940s. My grandfather's hair was parted neatly to the side and slicked back in the fashion of the era, while my grandmother's was styled in perfect victory rolls, her lips painted in what would have been a bold red in real life, though the black and white photograph rendered it as a deep gray. They both looked so young, far younger than any photos I had seen of them before. Grandma couldn't have been more than 20, her face unlined, her eyes bright with an innocence I never associated with the wise, sometimes stern woman who had raised me after my parents moved west. They stood in front of their house, this house, looking young and elegant. The Victorian architecture was unmistakable, though the gardens visible in the background were different from how I remembered them. Grandfather stood proudly beside her, his posture military straight, a remnant of his service in the war. His hand rested lightly on her shoulder, a gesture both protective and affectionate. They weren't smiling broadly. People rarely did in formal portraits of that era, but there was a contentment in their expressions, a quiet confidence about the future stretching before them. But something was wrong with the image, something impossible. In my grandmother's hand was what appeared to be a smartphone, sleek, rectangular, with the unmistakable shape of a camera lens in one corner. She was holding it at an angle, looking down at the screen, her finger poised as if about to swipe or tap. I nearly dropped the frame. This had to be a joke, or perhaps a clever forgery. Smartphones didn't exist in the 1940s. The first mobile phones weren't invented until the 1970s, and they were massive, nothing like the slim device in my grandmother's hand. This device in the photo looked remarkably like the latest iPhone model, the very same one I had in my pocket. I examined the photograph more closely, holding it up to the light, looking for signs of manipulation. The paper felt authentic, aged and slightly yellowed at the edges with the distinctive texture of mid-century photographic stock. The image itself showed no obvious signs of tampering, no irregular pixelation, no inconsistencies in lighting or perspective that would suggest digital alteration. Of course, a skilled forger could create something convincing, but why? Who would go to such trouble to place an anachronistic device in an old family portrait? As a museum curator specializing in 19th and 20th century artifacts, I'd developed a keen eye for fakes and reproductions. This photograph, apart from the impossible device it depicted, had all the hallmarks of authenticity: the paper stock, the chemical aging, the photographic style, even the subtle imperfections that machine reproduction typically eliminated. If this was a forgery, it was one of extraordinary sophistication. I checked the back of the frame, carefully removing the aged backing paper. A handwritten note in faded blue ink read, "Edmund and Eleanor Miller, June 12, 1947. The handwriting matched my grandfather's distinctive script from other documents I'd seen. The date seemed to confirm my initial estimate based on their clothing styles. Setting the portrait aside, I returned to the chest and examined the letters. Most were correspondence between my grandparents during the war, when grandfather was stationed in Europe with the Army Air Forces. The earliest was dated 1943, shortly after their marriage, and the letters continued through 1945, ending with his return home. The content was what you might expect: expressions of love and longing, mundane details of daily life, hopes for the future, occasionally redacted passages that presumably contained sensitive military information. Nothing unusual there, nothing that might explain the anomaly in the photograph. At the bottom of the chest, beneath the last bundle of letters, I found a leather-bound journal with my grandmother's initials, EGM, Eleanor Grace Miller, embossed in gold on the cover. My pulse quickened. A diary might provide answers that the formal correspondence could not. The light in the attic had grown dim as evening approached, the single bare bulb insufficient for reading the faded handwriting. I gathered the portrait and diary and descended the stairs, my mind racing with questions. In the kitchen, I poured myself a generous glass of red wine, a 2018 Cabernet I'd found in Grandma's modest wine rack, and settled at the oak table where I'd eaten countless meals throughout my childhood. The familiar surroundings felt suddenly strange, as if I were seeing them through new eyes. What other secrets might this house contain? The early entries were mundane: notes about housekeeping, social engagements, and neighborhood gossip. Eleanor had been a school teacher before marrying Edmund, and she occasionally mentioned missing her work. Then I reached an entry from May 1947. Something extraordinary happened today. I hardly know how to describe it, and I fear that if I put the words to paper, I'll be committed to an asylum. But I must record this somewhere, if only to convince myself later that I haven't lost my mind. The next page had been torn out. I flipped through the diary, finding several more pages missing at irregular intervals. The entries resumed in July 1947. Edmund believes me now. He's seen it too. We've agreed to tell no one. Who would believe us? Sometimes I hardly believe it myself, despite the evidence before my eyes. We've taken precautions. The device is hidden where no one will think to look. The woman, she says her name is Margaret, has taken a room at Mrs. Lindholm's boarding house on Maple Street. She visits us regularly, always after dark. Edmund has created a story that she's my cousin from Chicago, staying in town while looking for employment. The neighbors seem to accept this explanation, though Mrs. Prescott next door gives me knowing looks, as if suspecting some impropriety. If only she knew the truth, she'd think me mad rather than immoral. Device? Could she be referring to the object in the photograph? And who was this mysterious Margaret? The entries became more cryptic after that, with vague references to visitors and the incident. Eleanor wrote about headaches and trouble sleeping. She mentioned Edmund's growing anxiety, his insistence that they should end this business before it's too late. Then, in September 1947, Edmund thinks we should destroy it. Perhaps he's right. The temptation to use it is too great, and the risks are unknown. Margaret has explained the dangers, but I find myself drawn to the possibilities, the things I've seen. But Edmund is correct that we cannot change what is meant to be, and the burden of knowledge is sometimes too heavy to bear. Still, I can't bring myself to do it. It's my only connection to another torn page. I cursed under my breath. Whatever secret my grandparents had been keeping, they'd been careful to remove the most revealing details. But the pattern was clear. Something extraordinary had happened in the spring of 1947, involving a woman named Margaret and some kind of device. Could this Margaret have brought the smartphone seen in the portrait? But that was impossible. Who was she really, and what was her connection to my grandparents? I returned to the portrait, studying it under the bright kitchen light. There was no doubt about it. The object in my grandmother's hand was a modern smartphone, not a prototype or some 1940s device that coincidentally resembled one, but exactly like the iPhone in my own pocket. The resemblance was uncanny, down to the camera placement and the sleek design. It wasn't just smartphone-like. It was a smartphone, indistinguishable from the most recent models. I needed expert eyes. I took several high-resolution photos of the portrait with my own phone and emailed them to my colleague, Dr. Marcus Chen, a photography historian at the university where I occasionally lectured. Marcus had an encyclopedic knowledge of photographic techniques and technologies throughout history, and an almost supernatural ability to spot forgeries and manipulations. I also included a brief message. Marcus found this while cleaning out my grandmother's house. The photo appears to be from 1947, based on clothing styles and a date written on the back. Can you explain the anachronistic object in her hand? Is this some kind of camera prototype I'm not familiar with, or has the image been altered? Any insights appreciated. Emily. His response came within the hour, lighting up my phone as I was still poring over the diary entries. Interesting artifact. Where did you find this? The composition and fashion are consistent with late 1940s portraiture, but there's obviously an anachronistic element. Very clever Photoshop work, though the digital device is a bit on the nose. Is this for that art installation you mentioned last semester? If so, I'd suggest something subtler, perhaps a digital watch or calculator rather than a smartphone. The juxtaposition is too jarring to be effective as commentary on technological anachronism. So Marcus saw it too, immediately identifying the object as a modern smartphone. Not a hallucination then, but he assumed it was a deliberate digital manipulation for an art project, which was a reasonable conclusion. No rational person would look at that image and think it was genuinely from 1947. I replied, explaining that I'd found the portrait in my grandmother's attic and that, as far as I could tell, it was an original photograph from 1947, not a digital manipulation. I mentioned the diary entries as well, though not their specific content, just that my grandmother had written about some kind of unusual device around the same time the portrait was taken. While waiting for his response, I continued reading the diary. The entries from 1948 mentioned frequent headaches and nightmares. Eleanor wrote about hearing voices and seeing strange lights. Edmund had apparently consulted a doctor who prescribed sedatives. She described her unease at taking them. The pills make the vision stop, but they also dull my mind. I feel as though I'm moving through molasses. Edmund says it's for the best, that we must put the incident behind us and move forward with our lives. Margaret no longer visits. I wonder what became of her. Sometimes I think I imagined her entirely, that the stress of adjusting to post-war life affected my mind more severely than I realized. But then I see the portrait on the mantel, and I know it was real. By 1950, the tone had changed. The mentions of unexplainable phenomena had stopped. Eleanor wrote about Edmund's promotion at the bank, their consideration of having children, and plans for renovating the house. Normal life had seemingly resumed, the strange events of 1947 apparently forgotten or suppressed. The final entry was dated October 17, 1953. It's been 6 years since everything changed. Sometimes I wonder if it really happened, or if Edmund and I shared some elaborate delusion. The device has remained hidden all this time. Perhaps it's best if it stays that way forever. We've been blessed with a beautiful daughter now, our little Catherine, just learning to walk and saying her first words. The future, our future, looks bright and normal. Edmund has put the incident behind him entirely. He never speaks of it, and has forbidden me from keeping any records or mementos beyond what's already secured. Sometimes I catch him looking at the portrait on the mantel with an expression I can't quite decipher. Fear, regret, longing. But he quickly composes himself when he notices my attention. Some doors once opened cannot be easily closed again, but they can be locked and the key hidden away. For Catherine's sake, for our family's peace, that's what we've done. The entry ended there. The remaining pages of the diary were blank. Whatever had happened in 1947 had clearly affected my grandparents deeply, but they had eventually moved on with their lives. Catherine was my mother, born in 1952. She had never mentioned anything unusual about her parents or their past, but perhaps she had never known. If they had kept these secrets from their own daughter, it was no wonder the attic had been off limits to grandchildren. My phone rang, startling me. It was Marcus. "I've looked at your photos more carefully," he said without preamble, his voice filled with professional curiosity. "This is fascinating, Emily. If it's a forgery, it's extraordinarily well done. The film grain, the chemical aging of the paper, the correct light diffusion for studio photography of that period. These would be very difficult to fake convincingly, especially the micro details that only show up under magnification. So you think it might be authentic?" I asked, my pulse quickening. "I didn't say that," Marcus cautioned. "The inclusion of what appears to be a 21st century smartphone makes that impossible. There's simply no way that device existed in 1947. But it's a very sophisticated fake, perhaps the best I've ever seen. I'd like to examine the original if you don't mind. There are tests we can run that might reveal how it was created." "Of course," I agreed, though part of me was reluctant to share this family mystery with others just yet. "I'm still going through my grandmother's belongings. There might be more clues here that could explain it." "Keep me posted," Marcus said. "And Emily, be careful about sharing this with others for now. Without proper provenance and authentication, making claims about an artifact like this could raise eyebrows in academic circles." We arranged for him to visit the following afternoon. After hanging up, I returned to the portrait, studying it with fresh eyes. Something about the background caught my attention, a pattern of light and shadow I hadn't noticed before. Behind my grandparents, partially visible through a window of the house, was what appeared to be a reflection or a distortion in the air, like heat waves rising from hot asphalt. I magnified the image on my phone, zooming in on this peculiar visual artifact. The distortion had a distinct shape, roughly circular, with suggestions of structure within it. It matched exactly the description in my grandmother's diary entry from May 1947. A sort of shimmering in the air, like heat waves rising from hot asphalt in summer, but contained in a perfect circle about 6 feet in diameter. Not a random photographic artifact, but something deliberately captured by the camera, perhaps unintentionally, but captured nonetheless. I wondered if this might be related to the device mentioned in the diary. Had my grandparents somehow come into possession of technology far beyond what should have existed in the 1940s? It seemed impossible, yet the evidence was mounting that something truly extraordinary had occurred. Exhausted from the day's discoveries but too wired to sleep, I made myself a cup of chamomile tea and settled onto the living room sofa. The house felt different now, charged with mystery. I looked around at the familiar furnishings, the antique grandfather clock in the corner, the built-in bookshelves filled with leather-bound classics, the faded Persian rug that had been underfoot for as long as I could remember. Had my grandmother's mysterious visitor, Margaret, sat in this very room? Had my grandparents hidden some futuristic device somewhere in this house? That night I dreamed of my grandmother. She was young, as in the portrait, but dressed in modern clothing, jeans and a light sweater rather than the formal attire of the photograph. She held out a smartphone to me. "The code is your birthday," she said, her voice exactly as I remembered it from childhood. Backward. I woke up with a start, the dream still vivid in my mind. Your birthday, backward. Was my subconscious trying to tell me something? Or had I simply incorporated elements from my discoveries into a dream narrative? On impulse, I returned to the attic early the next morning, before Marcus was due to arrive. I began searching through the trunks again, this time with a specific purpose. If my grandparents had hidden a device, where would they put it? Somewhere secure, but accessible. Somewhere no one would think to look. I remembered how grandmother always kept her jewelry in a hidden compartment in her vanity, not the obvious jewelry box on top, which contained only costume pieces, but a sliding panel in the back of the bottom drawer that revealed a small safe. She had shown it to me when I turned 16, entrusting me with the combination in case anything happens to me. That safe now held only her will and a few family heirlooms of modest value, which I had already cataloged. But perhaps she had used similar hiding places elsewhere in the house. I examined the attic with new attention to detail, looking for irregularities in the construction, unusual seams in the wooden paneling, floorboards that didn't quite match the others, sections of wall that might conceal hidden compartments. Near the chimney stack, which ran through the center of the house from the basement to the roof, I found what I was looking for, a section of flooring that didn't quite match the rest. The wood was slightly darker, the grain pattern subtly different. To the casual observer, it would appear to be nothing more than a repair, but to my trained eye, it stood out. Using a screwdriver from my toolkit, I pried up the boards. They came away easily, revealing a small cavity beneath, and there, wrapped in a silk scarf of midnight blue and nestled in a bed of cotton batting that had yellowed with age, was a smartphone. Not just any smartphone, it was identical to the latest model iPhone, sleek and black with a camera array in one corner, exactly like the one in the portrait. My hands trembled as I carefully lifted it out. The device was in pristine condition, as if it had just come from the factory. No dust, no scratches on the screen, no signs of aging despite having been hidden for what must have been decades. I pressed the power button, half expecting nothing to happen after all these years. But the screen illuminated instantly, displaying a lock screen that requested a 6-digit passcode. Your birthday. Backward. I was born on April 9th, 1991. Backward. That would be 1990-40. I entered the digits with trembling fingers. The phone unlocked, revealing a home screen filled with familiar apps. Some I recognized from my own phone, others I didn't. The date in the corner read, June 12th, 2027. 2027. Almost 2 years in the future. I felt lightheaded, my pulse racing. This couldn't be real. It had to be an elaborate hoax. But who would go to such lengths? And why? The craftsmanship of the portrait, the authentic-seeming diary, and now this device that appeared to be from the future. It was beyond any practical joke or art project. The only explanation that made any sense was also the most impossible, that this was genuinely a smartphone from the future, somehow transported back to 1947 and hidden in my grandparents' attic for 75 years. My first instinct was to explore the device methodically. As a curator, I was trained to examine artifacts systematically, documenting everything before drawing conclusions. I opened the photo gallery, my fingers still unsteady on the screen. The most recent image was the portrait I'd found, the very same one showing my grandparents with the smartphone. I swiped to the next photo. It showed my grandmother standing next to a woman who looked remarkably like me, but with subtle differences. Slightly grayer hair, fine lines around the eyes that I didn't yet have, a small scar near her left eyebrow that I didn't possess. We were both smiling, standing in what appeared to be a laboratory of some kind, with complex equipment visible in the background. The timestamp on the photo was May 3rd, 2027, just over a month before the date shown on the phone's home screen. The resemblance was uncanny. This woman could have been my twin, or rather, me, in a few years' time. The rational part of my brain suggested a sophisticated deepfake, but the emotional part, the part still processing the diary entries and the portrait, whispered a more fantastic explanation, that I was looking at myself, or rather a future version of myself. I continued scrolling through the gallery. There were dozens of photos documenting what appeared to be the construction and testing of some kind of device. A large circular platform surrounded by equipment that looked like a cross between an MRI machine and a particle accelerator. In several images, men and women in lab coats adjusted controls and took measurements. Some of them looked directly at the camera, smiling or making thumbs-up gestures, the casual poses contrasting with the obviously sophisticated technology they were working with. The final photo in the sequence showed the device activated, a swirling vortex of light hovering above the platform, identical to the distortion I'd noticed in the background of my grandparents' portrait. The caption read simply, "First stable aperture, T-14 days." My hands were shaking so badly I nearly dropped the phone. This couldn't be real. Yet the evidence was literally in my hands, and it aligned perfectly with the mystery of the portrait and my grandmother's diary entries. If I accepted what I was seeing at face value, the only conclusion was that I, or rather, a future version of me, had somehow traveled back in time from 2027 to 1947, bringing this smartphone and encountering my grandparents. I opened the text messages. There was only one conversation between this phone and a contact listed as Eleanor M. The last exchange was dated June 11th, 2027. Everything is ready. The coordinates are set for your grandparents' house, June 1947. Remember, you'll have 24 hours before the tether pulls you back. Find the document and return to the exact spot. Nothing else can come through. The reply, I understand. Don't worry, I won't change anything else. This is our only chance to fix what happened. My doorbell rang, jolting me back to reality. Marcus. I had completely forgotten he was coming to examine the portrait. I quickly wrapped the phone in the scarf and placed it in my pocket. I needed time to process this before sharing it with anyone else. Marcus was enthusiastic about the portrait, examining it with a jeweler's loupe and ultraviolet light he'd brought with him. The chemical composition of the paper and emulsion are consistent with photographic processes from the 1940s, he said. If this is a forgery, it's been created using authentic materials from the period. But the smartphone? I prompted. He frowned. Yes, that's the puzzle. By all physical evidence, this photograph was taken in 1947, yet it contains an object that couldn't possibly have existed then. He looked up at me. There are only two explanations. Either this is the most extraordinarily sophisticated forgery I've ever encountered, or what? Or we're looking at evidence of something that defies conventional understanding of reality. He smiled sheepishly. But that's the realm of science fiction, not academic analysis. After Marcus left, I returned to the phone. The calculations are complete. The window will open at 10:17 a.m. on June 12, 2027, and remain stable for approximately 3 minutes, enough time for one person to pass through. I've been selected because of my genetic connection to the destination subjects. Dr. Kaminsky believes this will help stabilize the quantum entanglement, though he admits this is theoretical at best. The baseline simulations without a genetic link showed temporal fracturing in 78% of scenarios. The mission parameters are clear. Travel back to June 1947, locate the Miller residence, and retrieve the Stafford document before it's destroyed in the house fire of October 1953. According to the historical record, this document contained critical research on atmospheric carbon capture that could have prevented the climate catastrophes of the 2030s. The technology is untested on human subjects. The animal trials were successful. The retrieval team recovered the tagged objects from their historical locations, and the molecular degradation was within acceptable parameters. But sending a conscious human being through a temporal aperture is unprecedented. The ethical committee was divided, but the potential benefits outweigh the personal risk. If successful, we alter the course of climate science by decades. If I fail, well, no one will know the difference, will they? The timeline will continue as it always has. Personal note, I still can't believe I'm going to meet my great-grandmother Eleanor when she was younger than I am now. The temporal displacement team has warned me about emotional attachments. I must remember that any significant deviation from the planned intervention could have catastrophic consequences for the timeline. Get in, find the document, get out. No socializing, no warnings about future events, no attempts to change personal history. The butterfly effect is real, and we have no way to predict how even small changes might ripple forward through time. The entry ended there. I scrolled back through earlier notes, finding technical specifications for the temporal displacement device, risk assessments, and personal reflections on the ethical implications of time travel. None of it made sense from a scientific perspective, at least not based on current understanding of physics, yet it aligned perfectly with everything else I had discovered. One entry from April 2027 caught my attention. Grandfather's stories were true. All those years we thought his mind was slipping when he talked about meeting his own granddaughter before she was born. We humored him, exchanging glances behind his back. But he wasn't confused. He was remembering events that had yet to happen for me, but were in his past. The circular nature of temporal causality is dizzying. When did these events first occur? They're in my future, but also in the past. There's an original timeline where the document was lost, but that timeline also created the conditions for our research, which led to this intervention. It's an ontological paradox, but Dr. Kaminsky insists the mathematics allow for stable time loops, as long as certain boundary conditions are maintained. My doorbell rang, jolting me back to reality. Marcus. I had completely forgotten he was coming to examine the portrait. I quickly wrapped the phone in the scarf and placed it in my pocket. I needed time to process this before sharing it with anyone else. The implications were staggering, and I wasn't ready to face the inevitable skepticism, or worse, the potential for this discovery to become public before I fully understood it myself. But that didn't make sense. If my future self had completed this mission, wouldn't I remember it? Unless the me who made that journey was from a different timeline, a parallel reality that diverged from my own. I needed more information. I returned to the attic and resumed my search with renewed purpose. If the Stafford document was as important as the notes suggested, perhaps my grandparents had kept it, despite the reference to a fire in 1953. After hours of methodical searching through every trunk, box, and hidden corner of the attic, I found nothing resembling a scientific document. I expanded my search to the rest of the house, checking inside books for hidden papers, examining the backs of picture frames, even looking under floorboards in my grandmother's bedroom. Nothing. Exhausted and dusty, I leaned against the chimney stack in the attic, accidentally pressing against a loose brick. It shifted under my weight, revealing a small cavity in the wall that I hadn't noticed during my previous searches. My pulse quickened as I carefully removed the loose brick entirely, exposing a hidden compartment about the size of a shoebox. Inside was a metal canister, the kind used to protect important papers from fire and water damage. It was cylindrical, about 15 inches long and 5 inches in diameter, made of brushed stainless steel with a screw-on cap that had been sealed with what looked like wax. The surface was cool to the touch, unmarked except for a small engraving near the cap. E&E, 1947. Edmund and Eleanor, 1947. The year of the portrait, the year of the incident described in the diary. I carefully broke the wax seal and unscrewed the cap, which came loose with surprising ease given its age. Inside was a roll of papers protected by a layer of what appeared to be silk, then waxed paper. I carefully extracted the contents and unrolled them on the clean sheet I'd been using to sort smaller items. The document inside was yellowed with age, its pages brittle but intact. The title page read, Atmospheric Carbon Sequestration Through Enhanced Oceanic Absorption, a Theoretical Framework by Dr. James Stafford, Department of Chemistry, MIT, 1946. I stared at the title, my mind racing. This had to be the Stafford document mentioned in the notes on the future phone. I carefully photographed each page with my regular phone, creating a digital backup before reading further. The document ran to nearly 40 pages, filled with chemical formulas, mathematical equations, and detailed explanations written in the precise, formal scientific language of the mid-20th century. Most of the technical content was beyond my expertise, but the introduction and conclusion were clear enough. The document detailed a chemical process for removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere by enhancing the ocean's natural absorption capabilities. It described a catalyst that, when introduced to seawater in minute quantities, could dramatically increase the ocean's carbon dioxide uptake without harming marine life. The final section outlined potential implementation strategies, including dispersion methods and estimated costs based on 1940s industrial capabilities. The science was beyond my expertise, but even I could recognize the potential significance of such research in addressing climate change, especially if it had been developed and implemented decades before global warming became a recognized crisis. According to the notes on the future phone, this document contained research that could have prevented the climate catastrophes of the 2030s. If that was true, why had it been lost to history? The final page contained a handwritten note. Eleanor, I entrust this to you and Edmund for safekeeping. My colleagues think I've gone mad, but the calculations are sound. The petroleum interests have made it clear my work is unwelcome. Perhaps in a more enlightened time, someone will recognize the value of this work and implement it before it's too late. Guard it well, my friend. James. The note was dated April 12, 1946, nearly a year before the incident recorded in my grandmother's diary. I returned to my grandmother's diary, searching for mentions of James Stafford. In an entry from April 1946, she wrote, James visited today. He seems increasingly paranoid, convinced that certain industrial interests are trying to suppress his research. He talks about men following him, strange calls in the night, colleagues suddenly unwilling to speak with him. Edmund thinks he's overreacting, that his work is simply ahead of its time and facing the natural resistance that comes with paradigm-shifting ideas. But I saw the fear in James's eyes. This is more than academic politics. He's entrusted Edmund and me with his latest paper for safekeeping. I worry about him. Ever since his wife passed last year, he's been working obsessively, as if trying to save the world might fill the void she left. Edmund has offered to speak with some of his contacts at the bank about potential funding for James's research, away from the university system that's become so hostile to his ideas. And then, in November 1946, terrible news. James was found dead in his laboratory, an apparent suicide. A note was found, but Edmund doesn't believe it. James was excited about his work, making breakthroughs. He had no reason to take his own life. Just last week, he told us he had refined his formula, increasing its efficiency tenfold. Edmund has contacted the police, but they seem disinclined to investigate further. The death of an eccentric professor, no matter how suspicious the circumstances, is hardly a priority in post-war Boston, where resources are stretched thin and more violent crimes demand attention. The pieces were falling into place. James Stafford had developed a method for removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere in the 1940s, technology that might have prevented or mitigated the climate crisis. But his research had been suppressed, and he had died under suspicious circumstances. My grandparents had safeguarded his work, hiding it in their house until the fire of 1953, a fire that, according to the notes on the future phone, would destroy the document. Except the house hadn't burned down in 1953. It was still standing, and the document was still here, safely preserved in its metal canister. Had the timeline already been altered? Was I living in a changed reality without knowing it? I needed to understand what had happened, or what would happen, in 1953. I returned to my grandmother's diary, reading through the entries for that year. The early months were filled with ordinary domestic concerns: Catherine's development, Edmund's work at the bank, community events, and the ongoing Cold War tensions that formed the backdrop of American life in the early 1950s. In September, she mentioned strange men asking questions about James Stafford's research, claiming to be from the government. Edmund had turned them away, but Eleanor was frightened. The entry for September 18, 1953 read, "They didn't show any identification." Edmund asked directly which department they represented, and they were vague. "Government research," they said, but there was something in their manner that reminded me of the men James had described years ago. The same cold eyes, the same implied threats beneath polite questions. Edmund told them we knew nothing about James's work, that we had lost touch before his death. I don't think they believed him. I'm afraid for Catherine. She's too young to understand what's happening, but children sense when their parents are afraid. The entry for October 16, 1953, the day before her final entry, described a confrontation. They returned today, no longer bothering with the pretense of being government agents. 3 men in dark suits, driving an unmarked black sedan. They forced their way in when Edmund answered the door. They threatened him, said they knew we had James's research, that it was a matter of national security and economic stability. Edmund refused to cooperate. When he threatened to call the police, one of them laughed and said, "We are the authorities here." After they left, we agreed to hide the document in the secret compartment in the chimney. Edmund contacted the police anyway, but I doubt they'll do anything. I'm afraid. We're sending Catherine to stay with my sister in Springfield tomorrow, just to be safe. The next day's entry, the final one, mentioned nothing about a fire. Whatever had happened, Eleanor had either chosen not to record it or had been prevented from doing so. I checked the local historical records online, searching for news of a house fire in October 1953. Nothing. According to public records, the house had remained in my grandparents' possession continuously from 1942 until my grandmother's death 3 days ago. There was no record of a fire, reconstruction, or change in the property's status that would align with the future note's reference to a fire in 1953. Another sleepless night followed as I pondered the implications. If there had been no fire, and the document had survived, why would my future self need to travel back to retrieve it? The only explanation was that I was living in an already altered timeline, one where my future self had successfully changed history. But if that were true, wouldn't my future self remember making that journey? Wouldn't she know that the document had been saved? The circular logic made my head spin. The next morning, fueled by coffee and determination, I decided to contact Dr. James Stafford's descendants. Perhaps they could shed light on his research and its significance. A quick internet search revealed that his grandson, Dr. Michael Stafford, was a climate scientist at MIT, the same institution where his grandfather had worked almost 8 decades earlier. The coincidence seemed too perfect to be accidental, as if the family's intellectual legacy had followed a predetermined path through generations. Dr. Stafford's faculty profile showed a man in his early 60s with salt and pepper hair and intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. His research focused on oceanic carbon sequestration methods, exactly the subject of his grandfather's suppressed work. Could this be another temporal connection? Had fragments of James Stafford's research somehow survived and influenced his grandson's career choice? I crafted a careful email, explaining that I had found what appeared to be a research paper by his grandfather while cleaning out my grandmother's house. I attached the scanned document but made no mention of the time travel theory or the smartphone. Those elements would only undermine my credibility and potentially close doors that I needed to remain open. His response came within hours, his excitement palpable even through the terse professional language. "Ms. Miller, what you've discovered is extraordinary. My grandfather's research on carbon sequestration was thought to be lost entirely following his death in 1946. The document you've found represents a significant historical artifact in climate science. The approaches he proposed in 1946 anticipated techniques that weren't discovered until the early 2000s. His work was decades ahead of its time, and its loss has been lamented by those few scholars aware of his contributions. I would very much like to examine the original document in person. Would you be willing to bring it to MIT? I could clear my schedule as early as tomorrow if that works for you." I replied immediately, agreeing to meet him the following day. The opportunity to learn more about James Stafford and his research was too valuable to pass up, even if it meant a 2-hour drive to Cambridge. That evening, I carefully placed the Stafford document back in its protective canister. I also packed the portrait and diary, but after careful consideration, left the futuristic smartphone hidden in my bedroom. That particular piece of evidence raised too many questions I wasn't prepared to answer. 2 days later, I sat in Michael Stafford's office at MIT, the original document in a protective case between us. His office was exactly what you'd expect from a distinguished academic. Bookshelves overflowing with scientific texts, framed awards and diplomas on the walls, a whiteboard covered in formulas, and a large window overlooking the Charles River. A black and white photograph on his desk showed a young man in 1940s attire, presumably James Stafford, standing in a laboratory. Michael himself was a man in his 60s with intelligent eyes and a measured way of speaking that reminded me of my grandfather. He had the same careful precision in his movements, the same thoughtful pauses before responding to questions. He'd examined the document for nearly an hour, occasionally making notes or taking photographs of specific pages. Now he sat back in his chair, an expression of wonder on his face. "Your grandparents saved this," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "For 70 years, we believed all of my grandfather's research had been destroyed in the weeks following his death. His laboratory was vandalized, his home office ransacked. His colleagues suddenly became unwilling to discuss his work, as if he had become a scientific pariah overnight." "What happened to him?" I asked. "My grandmother's diary mentioned suspicions about his death." Michael nodded grimly. "The official record says suicide, but our family never believed it. My father, James's son, spent years trying to prove it was murder." He gestured to the document. "This research threatened powerful interests in the fossil fuel industry. If implemented, it could have dramatically reduced our dependence on oil and coal decades ago. The technology was elegant, efficient, and, most threatening of all, inexpensive. Could it still be useful today? Absolutely. The core principles are sound, though they'd need to be updated with modern materials and technologies. Some of the catalysts he proposed would be replaced with more environmentally friendly alternatives now available, but the fundamental approach..." He stopped suddenly, studying my face with new intensity. "I'm sorry, but you look remarkably familiar. Have we met before?" The question caught me off guard. "I don't think so. I've never been to MIT before today." He continued to study me, then shook his head slightly. "My mistake. Something about your expressions reminds me of someone." He returned his attention to the document. "As I was saying, this could absolutely be implemented today. In fact, my research team has been working on something similar, though without the benefit of my grandfather's insights. This could accelerate our progress significantly." "That's wonderful," I said, genuinely pleased that the document might finally fulfill its purpose. "My grandmother would have been happy to know it ended up in the right hands." Michael looked at me curiously. "It's remarkable that this survived. From what I understand, your grandparents' house burned down in 1953. I froze. "What did you say?" "The fire, October 17th, 1953. It was all over the local papers." He turned to his computer and pulled up a digitized newspaper archive. There it was, a headline from the Boston Evening Globe: "Local banker's home destroyed in suspicious blaze." According to the article, the home of Edmund and Eleanor Miller had burned to the ground in the early hours of October 17th, 1953. The couple had escaped unharmed, but all their possessions had been lost. Fire investigators suspected arson but had no leads. The article quoted my grandfather: "We're just grateful to be alive. Everything else can be replaced." There was a photo of the charred remains of the Victorian house. My grandmother's house, smoke still rising from the blackened timbers. That's impossible, I whispered, staring at the image on the screen. The house is still standing. I was just there yesterday. Michael looked confused. There must be some mistake. Your family home was rebuilt in 1954 on the same property, but the original Victorian structure was completely destroyed. No, that's not right. I pulled out my phone and showed him recent photos of the house, my grandmother's Victorian home, with its distinctive turret and wraparound porch. This is the house I grew up in. It's been in my family continuously since the 1940s. Michael stared at the images, baffled. This doesn't make sense. That house burned down 70 years ago. He turned back to his computer and pulled up another archived news article, this one from November 1953, about my grandparents purchasing a different property in a neighboring town. After the fire, they moved here. They never rebuilt on the original property. We were both silent for a long moment, trying to reconcile these contradictory realities. The house I had grown up in, the house where I had spent the past week sorting through my grandmother's belongings, was, according to historical records, nothing but ashes and memory. Dr. Stafford, I said finally, my voice steadier than I felt, do you believe time travel is possible? His eyebrows shot up. That's quite a change of subject. Please just answer the question. He leaned back in his chair, considering. As a scientist, I can't dismiss the theoretical possibility. Einstein's equations don't prohibit it, though the practical challenges are immense. The energy requirements alone would be... He trailed off, studying my face. Why do you ask? What if I told you I have evidence that someone from the future traveled back to 1947 to save your grandfather's research? His expression shifted from polite interest to intense focus. I'd say that's an extraordinary claim requiring extraordinary evidence. I hesitated, then reached into my bag and pulled out both phones, my own and the one from the future. I showed him the portrait of my grandparents, pointing out the smartphone and the distortion in the background. This was taken in 1947, I said. And this, I held up the future phone, contains notes about a mission to travel back in time to retrieve your grandfather's document before it was destroyed in the fire. For the next hour, I explained everything. The diary entries, the hidden phone, the notes detailing the time travel mission, and the contradiction between the historical record showing the house had burned down and the reality in which it still stood. I showed him the photos from the future phone, the text messages, the technical specifications for the temporal displacement device. Michael listened without interruption, his expression shifting from skepticism to fascination to cautious belief. He asked occasional clarifying questions, but mostly he absorbed the information, his analytical mind visibly working through the implications. If what you're suggesting is true, he said when I finished, running a hand through his gray hair, then we're living in an altered timeline, one where my grandfather's research survived, potentially changing the course of climate science. But that creates a paradox, I pointed out. If the document was saved and the house didn't burn down, why would my future self need to travel back to retrieve it? Perhaps she didn't know it had been saved. Or perhaps... He paused, his eyes widening with a new realization. Perhaps she didn't go back to retrieve the document at all. What do you mean? Think about it. The notes on the phone say the mission was to retrieve the document before the fire. But what if the real mission was to prevent the fire itself? To save both the document and your grandparents' home? It made a terrible kind of sense. My future self hadn't just retrieved the document. She had changed history by preventing the arson altogether. That would explain why the house still stood in my reality, despite historical records saying it had burned down. But that creates another problem, I said, feeling my way through the implications. If she changed history in 1953, how could she have traveled back from 2027 in a timeline where that change had already occurred? Wouldn't altering the past create a new timeline in which the future unfolded differently? Michael rubbed his temples. This is where time travel theory gets complicated. Some models suggest a self-consistent universe where any action taken by time travelers was always part of history. Others propose branching timelines or multiple worlds. He gestured to the phones. The fact that you have both your phone and the future phone suggests the latter. In the original timeline, your future self traveled back. In this timeline, the one we're in now, history played out differently. So there are two versions of me? The one who lives in this timeline and the one who traveled back from a future that no longer exists? Theoretically, yes. And two versions of me and two versions of everyone else. He shook his head. It's mind-bending. There's one way to find out for sure, I said. According to the notes, the temporal displacement device will be activated on June 12, 2027 at 10:17 a.m. If we're in an altered timeline where the document was saved and the mission is no longer necessary, that event won't happen. And if it does happen, then either the temporal mechanics are more complicated than we understand, or there's another reason for the mission that we haven't discovered yet. Michael considered this. There's something we're missing. If your future self prevented the fire in 1953, why keep that a secret? Why tear out pages from your grandmother's diary? Why hide the phone? Maybe to prevent further interference with the timeline? Possibly. Or maybe the full story is even more complex than we realize. We agreed to continue researching both the scientific and historical aspects of the mystery. Michael would analyze Stafford's document and determine its potential impact on climate science. I would search for more clues in my grandmother's belongings. One more thing, Michael said as I was preparing to leave. The woman in these photos on the future phone, the one who looks like you, there's something familiar about her. Not just her resemblance to you, but he frowned, searching his memory. My father used to show me old family photos. There was a woman who married into the family in the 1950s, my great-uncle's wife. Margaret, I think her name was. The resemblance is striking. A chill ran down my spine. Margaret, are you sure? Reasonably. I'd have to check the old albums. Why? My grandmother's diary mentioned a woman named Margaret who appeared mysteriously in 1947, the same time the smartphone appeared. Our eyes met, a new understanding passing between us. I need to see those family photos, I said, and I need to reread my grandfather's journals, Michael replied. If our families are connected across time somehow. Then we parted with a plan to reconvene in a few days, each of us pursuing our separate lines of inquiry. As I drove back to my grandmother's house, the house that shouldn't exist according to historical records, my mind raced with possibilities. What if my future self hadn't just visited 1947 and returned to her own time? What if she had stayed in the past, perhaps unable to return due to some malfunction or unforeseen consequence of her temporal intervention? That evening, as I drove back to the house, a new thought occurred to me. The final diary entry was dated October 17, 1953, the day of the fire that never happened in my timeline. What if Eleanor had written more after that, in a second diary? Back in the attic, I searched with renewed determination. In a steamer trunk filled with winter clothing, I found what I was looking for. Another leather-bound journal, nearly identical to the first, but with a different colored binding. The first entry was dated October 18, 1953. I still cannot believe what happened yesterday. A woman appeared in our living room as if out of thin air. The air shimmered and distorted, just as it had 6 years ago, and suddenly she was there. She knew our names. She had Edmund's eyes, my chin. She said she was our granddaughter from the year 2027. She warned us about the men who had been threatening us, said they would return that night to burn down our house and destroy James's research. We didn't believe her at first, until she showed us her device. A telephone, she called it, though unlike any telephone I've ever seen. It contained photographs of people and places I didn't recognize, and moving pictures like at the cinema, but in color so vivid it hurt the eyes. One of the photographs showed a girl she claimed was our daughter, a child we don't yet have. The resemblance to Edmund was unmistakable. She convinced us to leave the house, taking only James's document and a few valuables. We spent the evening at the Andersons' home down the street, claiming our furnace was malfunctioning and the repairman couldn't come until morning. From their front window, we watched our house. Shortly after midnight, a black car arrived. 2 men entered our house through the back door, which they somehow unlocked without difficulty. 10 minutes later, they emerged, and the house remained standing. Our visitor seemed confused. She checked her device, then looked at the house in disbelief. "This isn't right," she said. "The house should be burning by now." Then she made a startling confession. In her original timeline, Edmund had confronted the intruders and been killed in the struggle. The men had then set fire to the house to destroy the evidence, with me still inside. By convincing us to leave, she had changed history. Edmund and I survived, and so did our home. But this created what she called a temporal paradox. She seems both elated and terrified by what she has done. I turned the page with trembling hands. She cannot return to her time. Whatever future she came from no longer exists, replaced by a new timeline created by her intervention. She says she knew this might happen, but chose to save us anyway. What a terrible sacrifice. To give up her entire existence to save her grandparents. whom she never even knew in her original timeline. Edmund wants to go to the police, but she insists we cannot. The men who tried to destroy James's research are powerful, connected to industrial interests that stand to lose billions if his carbon sequestration method becomes widely adopted. If they learn we survived and still have the document, they will try again. We must disappear, assume new identities, and hide the research where it can never be found. As for our visitor, our granddaughter, she will stay with us. We'll create a new identity for her as my cousin from Chicago, recently widowed during the war. Edmund has contacts who can provide the necessary documentation without asking questions. It's the least we can do for the woman who saved our lives, even if it means living in the shadows. The diary continued, detailing their plans to fake their deaths and establish new lives in another state. Eleanor wrote about the difficulties of adjusting to this deception, about Edmund's nightmares, about her own guilt over cutting ties with friends and family. She described the elaborate scheme they concocted, staging a car accident on October 31st, 1953, using the bodies of two unidentified transients who had died of exposure and been unclaimed at the city morgue. Edmund had bribed an official to release the bodies, which were placed in their vehicle before it was pushed over a cliff and burst into flames. With the help of Edmund's contacts in the banking industry, they established new identities as Edward and Ellen Matthews, relocating to a small town in Vermont. Their cousin, whom they named Margaret, lived with them for several years before marrying a local doctor named Thomas Stafford, James Stafford's younger brother. My heart nearly stopped when I read that name. Margaret, my future self, had married into the Stafford family. The connection to Michael wasn't coincidental. We were related through marriage, through a union that had only occurred because of a temporal intervention. Eleanor occasionally mentioned visits from Margaret and Thomas, and later, their children. She wrote about the challenge of maintaining their secret, of creating a plausible backstory that would explain their sudden appearance in Vermont. They claimed to be distant relatives of the original Millers, who had perished in a tragic accident. The deception weighed on Eleanor, but she believed it necessary to protect both James's research and the fragile new timeline they inhabited. The final entries from the early 1970s describe their decision to reclaim their original home after the death of Richard Dawson, the oil magnate who had orchestrated the attempt on their lives and James's research. With Dawson gone and his company splintered by antitrust legislation, the immediate threat had passed. They had purchased the house through a series of shell companies to avoid detection, gradually transitioning back to their true identities while maintaining the fiction that they were distant relatives of the original Millers. By then, the research had been hidden so thoroughly that even Eleanor wasn't sure where Margaret had concealed it. The diary ended with a reflection on the strange circular nature of their family history, how their granddaughter had saved them before she was even born, creating the very timeline in which she would eventually exist. "Sometimes I wonder if this is how it was always meant to be," she wrote in the final entry. "If time is not a straight line but a loop, constantly feeding back into itself. Margaret insists we've created a new timeline, different from the one she left behind. But perhaps there is only one timeline, intricate and self-correcting, where cause and effect blur into a complex tapestry that only makes sense when viewed from outside time itself. Whatever the truth, I am grateful for the years we might never have had, for the daughter we might never have raised, for the granddaughter who sacrificed her future to give us ours. The universe works in mysterious ways indeed." I sat in the attic until dawn, piecing together the full story from the diaries, the notes on the future phone, and the newspaper archives Michael had shown me. The story that emerged was both beautiful and tragic. In the original timeline, my grandparents had died in 1953. Their house had burned down, and James Stafford's research had been lost. Climate change had accelerated unchecked, leading to catastrophes in the 2030s. Scientists in 2027, including myself, had developed time travel technology and sent me back to retrieve the document before it was destroyed. But I, or rather my future self, had done more than that. She had saved my grandparents, prevented the fire, and preserved the document. In doing so, she had created a new timeline, my timeline, where Edmund and Eleanor survived, eventually reclaimed their home, and lived long enough for me to know them. She had chosen to remain in the past, knowing she could never return to her original timeline, and had lived out her life as Margaret, my grandmother's supposed cousin, the woman I had known briefly as a child, the quiet, bookish woman who had always shown special interest in me, who had given me my first chemistry set and encouraged my love of history, had been a version of myself, stranded in the past by her own actions. She had married Thomas Stafford, becoming part of the very family whose research she had been sent to save. Michael wasn't just a colleague. He was my distant relative through this impossible temporal connection. I returned to the chest where I'd found the first diary and portrait. At the very bottom, beneath a false panel I hadn't noticed before, I discovered an envelope addressed to me in familiar handwriting, my own. The paper was yellowed with age, but the ink remained clear and legible. The letter inside was dated June 13, 1947. To Emily, if you're reading this, you've discovered the truth. I am you, or rather, a version of you from a timeline that no longer exists. By the time you were born in 1991, I had already been living in the past for decades. I watched you grow up from a distance, always careful not to interfere too directly in your life. It was strange, seeing a version of myself develop along a different path, in a world that was itself different from the one I had known. I was born in 1991, just as you were, but in a world headed for disaster. My parents, our parents, died when I was young, victims of increasingly violent storms that scientists attributed to climate change. I was raised by distant relatives who had never met Edmund and Eleanor Miller. I became a physicist, specializing in quantum mechanics and theoretical temporal dynamics. In 2025, I joined a government project dedicated to developing time travel technology, not as a fantastical exploration, but as a desperate last resort to save a dying planet. By then, the environmental collapse was accelerating beyond our ability to mitigate it. Coastal cities were underwater, agricultural regions had become deserts, and resource wars had destabilized much of the world. Our project leader, Dr. Michael Stafford, yes, the same family name is no coincidence, discovered references to his grandfather's early work on carbon sequestration, work that had been lost in a house fire in 1953, the same fire that killed Edmund and Eleanor Miller, who had been entrusted with the research. We developed the temporal displacement technology in a desperate race against time. The theory suggested we could alter the timeline by making surgical interventions at critical junctures. My mission was simple: travel back to 1947, locate the Millers, earn their trust, and ensure the safety of the Stafford document. I was chosen because of my genetic connection to the Millers, which our model suggested would help stabilize the temporal aperture. I made the choice knowing I could never return. The mission parameters were clear: retrieve the document and return to 2027. But when I arrived and met Edmund and Eleanor, our grandparents, who in my timeline had died long before I was born, I couldn't bear to let history repeat itself. I broke protocol. Instead of simply taking the document, I warned them about the men who would come to destroy it, and them along with it. In my original timeline, they died in 1953. The research was lost. The climate catastrophes of the 2030s killed billions. We developed time travel too late to save the world, but perhaps early enough to create a better one. By saving Edmund and Eleanor, I fundamentally altered the timeline. The butterfly effect rippled forward through time, creating the world you've grown up in. A world where climate science progressed more rapidly, where carbon sequestration techniques were implemented decades earlier, where the worst impacts of climate change were mitigated before they became irreversible. The portrait was a mistake. Eleanor was fascinated by my phone, and Edmund insisted on commemorating my arrival with a professional photograph. I knew it was risky, but I couldn't refuse them, not when I was about to change their lives forever. I thought the photograph would be destroyed in the fake accident we staged, but Eleanor secretly preserved it, along with her diaries and the phone, hiding them in the house when they reclaimed it years later. Perhaps she intended for you to find them someday, to understand the truth about your family's unusual history. I've lived a good life here, Emily. Different from what I had planned, but meaningful. I married a kind man, Thomas Stafford, James's younger brother. The irony wasn't lost on me that I became part of the very family whose research I had been sent to save. We had children. Your mother was one of them, though she never knew I was not who I claimed to be. I watched you grow up, pretending to be a distant relative when I was actually a version of you from a timeline that no longer exists. It was strange and wonderful, witnessing your childhood, seeing the similarities and differences between us. You are me, but also entirely yourself, shaped by a world I helped create but never fully belonged to. The document is safe. Michael Stafford, yes, James's grandson, and through my marriage to Thomas, my nephew, will help you understand its significance. In my timeline, the Stafford sequestration technology came too late. In yours, it can be implemented decades earlier. The climate crisis you face now is serious, but manageable. The climate apocalypse I fled from will never come to pass. The smartphone I brought with me is hidden in the attic. The code is your birthday, backward. It contains everything you need to know about the original timeline and the technology that sent me here. Guard it carefully. If it falls into the wrong hands, history could be changed again, perhaps catastrophically. The phone's battery should have died decades ago, but it's powered by a quantum cell designed to last a century or more. The temporal displacement team thought of everything, except the possibility that their agent might choose compassion over mission parameters. I don't know if there are other timelines, other versions of us making different choices. Temporal mechanics was never my specialty. I was just desperate enough to volunteer for a one-way trip into the past. But I believe we're all connected somehow, across time and possibility. The fact that you're reading this letter proves that the universe allows for second chances, for redemption, for the opportunity to heal old wounds before they're inflicted. Take care of our grandparents' legacy. And remember that sometimes, the greatest scientific discoveries aren't technological breakthroughs, but acts of courage and compassion that change the course of history. With love across time, Margaret, Emily, Miller Stafford. I folded the letter and placed it back in the envelope, my hands trembling with emotion. Outside, the sun was rising, casting long shadows across the yard. The house, my grandparents' house, saved from destruction by a version of myself I would never meet, stood solid and real around me, a testament to the power of a single choice to alter the course of history. The portrait of my grandparents, with the impossible smartphone in my grandmother's hand, now made perfect sense. It wasn't an anomaly or a hoax, but physical evidence of a timeline that had been rewritten by love. I picked up my phone, my regular phone, not the one from the future, and called Michael Stafford. Despite the early hour, he answered immediately, as if he'd been waiting for my call. "I found the rest of the story," I said when he answered. "And you were right, it's even more complex than we imagined. Your great-aunt Margaret, she was me, or rather, a version of me from the future who traveled back to 1947. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then, I know. I found my father's journals last night. He wrote about his mysterious aunt who appeared in the family in the 1950s, who knew things she shouldn't have known, who sometimes made predictions that always came true. He suspected there was something unusual about her, but never connected the dots. I have photographs of her, of you, throughout her life here. It's uncanny. We're related," I said, the realization still fresh and strange. "Through her marriage to your great-uncle Thomas. Second cousins once removed, I think, or something like that. The family tree gets complicated when it includes time travel." He laughed, a sound of wonder rather than humor. "Emily, do you realize what this means? The climate catastrophes she described in her timeline, they never happened in ours. Her intervention changed everything. The carbon sequestration techniques based on my grandfather's research have been in use since the 1970s. The atmospheric carbon levels in our world are half what they would have been otherwise. She sacrificed her entire existence to create a better world," I said softly. "And to save your grandparents," Michael added. "It was personal as well as global. She changed history out of love. Love for family she had never known, and love for a world she hoped to save." We agreed to meet later that day to share our discoveries in person. As I hung up, I walked to the window and looked out at the garden, where generations of my family had tended flowers and vegetables. The same garden where the photograph of Margaret and my grandmother had been taken, their arms linked in familiar affection, despite the impossible circumstances of their relationship. I thought about the choices we make, how they ripple outward through time in ways we can never fully anticipate, how a single act of courage or compassion might alter the course of history, how love ultimately might be the most powerful force in the universe, capable of transcending even the boundaries of time itself. The end.